Well, I want to thank you for being part of the really warm welcome that I've received being here. It's just been terrific. This congregation is regularly, and all the congregations of the ELCA, which is about 9,600 congregations, one of the most generous in this area of world hunger and in responding to disasters. You are amazing in the ways that you see that this connects with your faith, and so I want to thank you for that. I want to encourage you in that as well today. When we started this conversation about being here this Sunday, it was months and months ago, and it was about World Hunger Sunday. And what's happened in the last, it's been 6 weeks now, is that we've had a series of 3 hurricanes, now 4 as of today, that have hit the United States. We have had 2 earthquakes in Mexico. We've had drought that's in Africa. We've had other areas of flooding and of catastrophe around the United States and around the world. In these key locations, and we've had waves of people who have left from Myanmar and Burma into Bangladesh. Every one of those places, you have been present. You have had a presence long before these moments of crisis. You have been part of the community in the midst of that crisis. And because of the generosity that you and others have shown, you have been able to respond to that crisis. That's what it means to be connected together as a church. Now, in the last couple weeks for us in the office, particularly, there's been an extra effort for Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And we have probably received almost as many calls and inquiries and really broken-hearted conversations about Puerto Rico and the Caribbean as we ever have in any disaster. People have an affinity, an understanding who have been there. We had, as a church, an astounding response to the last hurricanes that have gone through Puerto Rico. We have 27 congregations that are in Puerto Rico. We have 7 that are in the Virgin Islands. We have a strong tie with work that's going on in Haiti, as do you, that have also been impacted by the storms. The response in Puerto Rico, typically our response is that we're already in the community. So rather than needing to send in a lot of goods, we actually are already there, and we're handling goods that other organizations may be sending in, people who don't have the ground game that we have, and so that we can reserve the resources and the gifts that are coming from congregations and individuals committed to this work, reserve them to fill the gaps, or to be able to do the longer-term response. That's really an astounding possibility for us. But in the case of Puerto Rico, we're actually, we have shipments ready to go based on items that have been called for. We had satellite phones that went in this last week. Prior to that, we used SMS text, which is what we're used to using in an international context, but not in the U.S. So it really has been an astounding connectedness. We have never for a day doubted that behind the response that we're enabling with the church and with the social service work that's in Puerto Rico, we've never doubted that behind us is a strong, consistently dedicated, clearly driven, and committed church. And that's you. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for the ways that year in and year out you have held out the concern for hunger as a way of seeing what others might not see. Not just the need that's in the world, but the possibility of the dignity, the ways in which God has given gifts to those people who are even in hungry families for the future, for hope and possibility, if only brothers and sisters would stand with them in the midst of this time of trial and crisis. You have been those people. Some of them are people you know. Many of them are strangers you'll never know. And we have the privilege of being the connecting point between you and they. And I want to thank you. I want to talk a little bit about this kind of context of hunger and who are we? Who are we as a church in this? You know, in many ways, you can see yourselves, and we're not very good at bragging about this as Lutherans, but we ought to brag a little bit. There's some ways that we're on the side of heroes, that we are standing in astounding ways in the midst of a challenge that has been before humanity for all of humankind and all of time. And we get it. We get what's going on. So, you should say, we are heroes. We are heroes. Does that feel right? No, sometimes heroics are simple matters. I have to say, this is important for us to own. God is doing something heroic in the world through this. Now, I also want to say that it is great for us to claim ourselves with a sense of pride, but we also have a message of humility. And that is, in the midst of this great stuff that we do, the people who are on the front line are the people who really are hungry, who face hunger, who are challenged in their families all the time. We know how to do this as church because we've been present as church. You heard the story about the 7 that were called forward from a community that was faced with hunger in the time of Acts. You see, backing the local folks to be able to create the solution for their own community. That's the vision of that story. To find the right people, not just the chief and the chief's brother and the chief's wife, but in fact the right people, the people of integrity and possibility in the midst of that situation. That's what that story is about. We're pioneers in this idea that the solutions for a community's challenge rests in the hands of the community. If feeding for us is only about food, then there is no way that the community can ever see itself into the future that God has prepared for it. We see that. We've been pioneers in that. When we started this venture 50 years ago, there were 1 in 4 people in the world who were in a situation of extreme food insecurity. That means that they were hungry for a season. That they were hungry in time. I missed a slide here. I'm just looking here. So, which is this slide, which is, yes, 1 in 4. Thank you. So 1 in 4 in the world were challenged with this extreme food insecurity, seasons of hunger, weeks or multiple times in the year when somebody is hungry. That kind of extreme hunger robs children of their potential. It leaves them stunted. It robs people of their energy to be able to go out and tend their fields. 50 years ago, 1 in 4. With this kind of approach of investing in communities, which the church has pioneered and others have taken up as the solution to long-term root causes of hunger, right now there is 1 in 10 in the world that are exposed to this kind of extreme food insecurity. That's the kind of progress that has happened in many of our lifetimes. This is greater progress than has ever happened historically related to extreme food insecurity. You have been part of that effort. I want to tell you about a couple of examples of what's going on. We work in about 240 projects in 60 countries around the world. And so I just can't tell you about all of them. That includes thousands of communities that are being addressed in need. Many of them in this area of extreme food insecurity. We also partner with churches all over the United States to start up and to encourage the deepening of programs locally. And you know about that too, because this congregation is astounding in its response in this community to hunger that is local. Of the 60 countries, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are impacted because of the gifts that you give, and I am just going to tell you about 2 of them. One of them is a family that's in Indonesia. It's a family of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, actually, his family was impacted by the tsunami that hit Indonesia, almost 15 years ago. Now, they were already impoverished. He writes, when he was telling his story, he said, I couldn't finish school because my parents were too poor. What he had to say is, disasters tend to hit the people who are most vulnerable most profoundly. And so they lost any opportunity. And so he and his wife were displaced. As you can see, they have 2 children, a daughter and a son. He came with a group of people to ask the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran Church's program in Indonesia to help them for the future, because he said, our children do not have enough to eat. But he said even more than that. He said, we have rice and we have bananas maybe once a day. But he said, our real problem is water. We have to walk long distances to get water. It means that we can't work the fields. Our children can't go to school. One person said, you're born in these communities with either a book or a bucket in your hand. As long as you need to walk for water, you can't go to school. And even if his children had wanted to go to school, they couldn't afford the uniforms and they couldn't keep them clean. And so one of the opportunities was to support this community with clean water and this family with clean water. The Lutheran Church in Indonesia is actually larger than the ELCA, than the Lutheran Church in the U.S. We don't think of Indonesia as a Christian country, but in fact it is. But it's principally a middle-class church. But they have seen that their mission is to go out into the countryside to help families like Hezekiah's. And so they came up with, through your support, the wellhead and all the material for the wells. But the family had to dig, and they had to provide the sand, and they had to provide the cement. And the family said, we also need a latrine. Our children will continue to be sick, even if we have a well, if we don't have a latrine. And so while we helped to provide some of the material, they extended themselves from this meager amount of resources they have for 1 meal a day for each person to be able to have a latrine in that area. He said, we hope that our children will one day own a small business and have their own income. We hope they are 100 times better. That's who we are, not just providers of food, but in fact, instillers of hope. I'd like to tell you another story from Colombia. This is a story, the Colombian church actually has a long history of being able to go out and help people. The Lutherans have tended to be safe in Colombia, but to go out and help in the communities with peace and reconciliation. Little did we know that this would come back eventually to be critically important for the Lutheran community as the Congi. The Congi people are one of the indigenous people in Colombia. And a group of the Congi people decided that they wanted to be Lutheran. Now, they lived on indigenous land, and so the council members of the Congi people decided if they were going to be Lutheran, then they no longer had access to the indigenous land for people who were living in traditional ways of life. And so they were put off the land. You helped to provide them land, but more than just land, to provide them the opportunity for schools. These are the Congi teachers that you see here. I mean, I love the faces of these people, this kind of sense of hopefulness and determination, this kind of sense of self-respect of a people who have been put out and yet have been lifted up at the same time. It's that kind of connection that we have with one another that brings this possibility. The Congi people also said we cannot solve our problems with hunger if we don't solve our problems of health as well. And so they trained health workers. This is the school, and then the next picture is of the health workers of the Congi people with one of our global mission associates. What's ironic, maybe even Holy Spirit led, is over time, these schools and this health work has become so well known and so well respected that the rest of the Congi people now are coming to the Lutheran school and the Lutheran clinic. You see, this heart of peace and reconciliation, this possibility of responding to hunger, begins with being able to see not only with eyes of compassion of the challenge and the suffering and that is before us, but also with eyes of dignity, to see that the people who other people in the world might look at as those who are suffering, those who are poor, those who do have no possibility, are indeed children of God, people of hope. That's what you do when you stand with people in the midst of this kind of time of trouble and hardship. You know, in Scripture, food is never just about food. Here, bread is not just about bread. And yet, food is about food, and bread is sometimes about bread. In our gospel lesson today, it comes at the end of the Gospel of John, where Jesus welcomes the disciples back from a fishing trip. A failed trip, it looked like, until he told them, hey, cast the nets on the other side of the boat. And what looked like a situation of scarcity became one that, through eyes of faith, were one of abundance. And they came to the seashore, and he shared with them. And he invited Peter with the question, do you love me? 3 times he asked, in the same way that Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, do you love me? And the commandment each time was, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Now, food in that situation is about so much more than just food. But sometimes it's just about food. In the days in which the church was being persecuted late in the 3rd and early in the 4th century, food became the way in which those who were followers of Jesus Christ were known. For as they broke the bread, then they went out to help those in need. The Emperor Justinian decided that he wanted to squash this movement. He wouldn't call them the followers of Jesus Christ or Christians. He called them the Galileans. You could read it, those impious, but I like reading it impious. Those impious Galileans got so angry because eventually he was losing this. He goes, those impious Galileans who feed not only their hungry poor, but ours as well. You see, even then, our brothers and sisters saw the possibility in the eyes of others who were ignored. These days, we are a church that is less threatening and more easily ignored. We can be seen as something of old, something whose vitality, some place whose vitality is of the past, but we know better. We know better. How will they know us, we Christians? How will this love be lived out in ways visible? You see, I think in many ways this hunger work is not just an extra ministry off to the side, but the core of who we are. And wouldn't it be wonderful if in this community they go, those impious Lutherans who feed not only their hungry poor, but ours as well. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. I hope this video can further the discussion of your relationship with Christ, either at home or maybe in the comments below.